Welcome to Expiscor, the web blog of Stephen Hall, Director General of WorldFish. In these blogs, Steve gives his personal reflections on current topics and areas of debate in the realm of fish and development. In this podcast, Steve provides a compelling case for fully embracing a gender transformative approach in agricultural research and development.
For any organisation trying to decide how best to achieve development impact, a good place to start is with a theory of change. Formally defined as a statement of the interconnected causal pathways that describe the types of interventions that bring about desired outcomes, a theory of change can be more plainly said to be a description of what you need to do to make a difference. I was fortunate to recently attend a workshop here in Penang on gender transformative research in agricultural development. And at that meeting, theories of change were discussed. And that was an important discussion because, as I explained in my last post, not all researchers are agreed about whether gender transformative research should be pursued by agricultural research organisations. Without a compelling rationale that forms part of a clear theory of change, that situation is likely to persist. One of the key outcomes of our discussion was the following proposition. We'll increase productivity in complex agricultural systems in ways that are economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable if we improve gender equity. Now, I think that's an enormously important, powerful, and compelling statement, because leaving aside for a moment the moral imperative of striving for gender equity, it provides a mission-driven rationale for investing in gender transformative research as part of our wider agricultural research portfolio. As a description of the causal pathway for a gender transformative research approach that leads to impact, I think it should be an explicit part of the CGIAR's theory of change for agricultural research. Let's unpack the various elements of the statement a little bit to explain why I think its adoption is so important. And let's start with that idea of increasing productivity. Although those words were carefully chosen, the term productivity in the proposition I described earlier generated considerable disquiet among some workshop participants. The reason for the disquiet was that when agricultural researchers talk about increasing productivity, they're often using shorthand for increasing crop yields. But the formal definition of productivity is the returns obtained per unit of inputs applied, a definition that extends well beyond crop yields. And it's in that broader sense that we need to think about the impacts of gender transformative research on productivity. For example, altering gender norms and behaviours about the intra-household distribution of food or income has got nothing to do with increasing crop yields, but it can deliver huge improvements in the nutritional and educational outcomes for children. And we can also expect gender transformative research to deliver returns to income, time, food production, resilience, risk reduction, and environmental protection. And these are all domains in which the CGIAR must deliver outcomes. Let's return to that proposition again. We will increase productivity in complex agricultural systems in ways that are economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable if we improve gender equity. And that term improve gender equity needs talking about too. To be clear, although adopting a gender transformative approach remains contentious, few researchers question the importance of integrating gender issues into agricultural research. Studies from the 1970s onwards have both documented gender disparities in access to resources, markets and technologies, and generated the evidence to show the increases in productivity that can be achieved when they're removed. The excellent video by the FAO entitled Close the Gap provides a compelling summary, and you can find a link to that video on the written version of this podcast on our website. And it's also true that development agencies and researchers have increasingly responded to the evidence about gender integration by seeking to embed into their programs gendered analysis and interventions to reduce inequities in access to resources. But improving gender equity connotes much more than the current effort to mainstream and integrate gender into programs. And it's in this phrase that the call for a transformational approach to gender lies. In essence, it implies that agricultural researchers must not only try and address the consequences of gender inequity, they must also seek to understand and challenge its root causes. For example, as well as working to enhance women's access to credit or a new technology, say, we must also research and seek to challenge ingrained societal beliefs that limit what women can do and what they can't do, or the assets they can or they can't hold. And unless we do that, our record of failure to close the gender gap that we've known about since the 1970s is going to continue. And it will bring with it consequent lost opportunities to increase and sustain agricultural productivity. It was Einstein who famously quipped, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." Let's now think about that term complex agricultural systems, which is also included in the proposition I've discussed. Complex farming systems are diverse production and livelihood systems where families cultivate a range of crops, raise livestock, farm or catch fish, gather fruits or other tree crops, and harness natural resources such as timber, reeds, and wildlife. While the Green Revolution has helped many billions of people increase incomes and become food secure, many of the farmers, fishers and herders who live in complex farming systems continue to live on less than $1 a day. In aquatic agricultural systems, for example, a third or more of the 700 million people who depend on them for their livelihoods are in this position. Complex farming systems also take place within complex social systems, which contribute to persistent poverty, unequal gender relations, and differential access to and control of resources. This means that investing in a gender transformative approach will be especially powerful because it's a way of effecting change in these systems. Such persistent poverty also tells us that traditional technological approaches to improve the lives of these people are simply not working. Once again, we've got an argument for adopting new approaches, such as those embodied in the gender transformative research approach. Now let's talk about another phrase: economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable increases in productivity. I'm sure there are few people who would question the importance of not only achieving productivity increases, but also sustaining them over the long term. And as with our conception of productivity, our view of sustainability must be broad. This too is where much of the power of a gender transformative research approach emanates, because it offers avenues for pursuing all of the dimensions of sustainability and thinking about these in different ways. We need to think, for example, about issues such as meeting the labour and technology demands for sustaining productivity increases in the immediate future when more and more men are going to move off-farm to waged labour in cities. We need to think about meeting the aspirations of young people in rural areas to ensure social cohesion and much-needed security. And we need to think about helping children, who will soon be youths, to have more and better livelihood options, and building the skills and capabilities they need to succeed. We also need to think about building the adaptive capacity and resilience of rural communities to the inevitable changes that climate change will bring. A broad perspective on sustainability also demands that we recognise both the quantitative and the qualitative characteristics of the productivity increases we're looking for, and that we balance what can be sometimes conflicting interests. Reconciling, for example, the interests of those seeking to achieve social equity with those for whom sustainable natural resource use or economic development takes precedence is often going to be challenging. Once again, this is an area where the potential of gender transformative approaches to effect change and negotiate mutually agreeable outcomes is very clear. Now, all of this requires quite a challenging transformation. For some researchers, this move to a gender transformative research approach is a radical shift that takes them uncomfortably into the domain of social change and activism. I think part of this discomfort stems from the belief that because pursuing a gender transformative approach can legitimately be viewed as an ethically and morally justified end in itself, it falls outside the agricultural research domain. I even agree that if this were the only justification for pursuing the approach, and that it had no impact on productivity, it would be difficult to argue that it's got a place in the agricultural research portfolio. But all the evidence indicates that improving gender equity and increasing women's empowerment will improve agricultural productivity and help sustain it. So if we really want to make a difference, we've got to include efforts to research how underlying gender norms, gender behaviours and structures lead to inequality, and work with partners to challenge and shift those things. For those who worry about adopting a social change agenda, I also think we need to recognise that to pursue gender equity is, in essence, to drive for equality of opportunity for self-determination. When all parties have got that right, we can expect mutually negotiated outcomes between genders that are perceived by those concerned to be fair. That might mean in some cases that mum continues to play the role she always has, but it will be on the basis of informed individual choice, not societal coercion or constraint. Now for me, striving for such a fundamental freedom trumps any qualms one might have about social activism. It should be clear by now that I believe the case for fully embracing a gender transformative approach is compelling, but widespread adoption is going to require a change in mindset for many agricultural researchers. The principal change we need is a much wider acceptance that adopting a gender transformative research approach will lead to qualitatively better, more rapid and sustained improvements in agricultural productivity. It's this that legitimises engagement by the agricultural research community. Adopting a gender transformative research approach also demands that we recognise that actively striving for equality and the right of all individuals to decide what's right for them, expanding the range of options open to them, adopting a gender transformative research approach also demands that we recognise that actively striving for equality and the right of all individuals to decide what's right for them, expanding the range of options open to them, and increasing awareness of what those options are all legitimate activities for agricultural research institutions. My sense is that these messages are starting to be heard. It's heartening, for example, that the CGIAR Fund Council has just established a separate gender fund to support innovation in this area. That's a welcome development, but we'll also need energy and commitment from individual champions and the right incentives, structures and accountabilities in our various institutions to unleash the true power of gender transformative research approaches. I look forward to everyone here at WorldFish being a part of that effort and to seeing the impact that's surely going to result.
Thank you for listening to Expiscor, the web blog of Stephen Hall. If you have any comments or feedback on this podcast, go to blog.worldfishcentre.org or email expiscor@worldfishcentre.org. Also, be sure to find us on iTunes and subscribe to this podcast.